Hello, and welcome to Fixation, where I talk to my guests about their fiction fixations. I am Daniel Radford, author and podcast host, and all that good stuff. And I'm joined by Eva Langston, who is herself also an author and podcast host, and all that good stuff.
Yes, same. Thanks so much for having me. I didn't actually know the name of this podcast until now,
Yeah, no, I
and
completely
it's
forgot to tell you.
and it's perfect because I am fixated on this book, and maybe unhealthily or healthily obsessed with it. So I'm very excited to talk about it.
I think there's a very scant few books you could be unhealthily obsessed with.
That's true.
That's a complete lie. I've seen fandoms. That's not true at all.
Well, and actually, I was thinking, so we're talking about Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, and I was thinking, well, an unhealthy obsession with this book would be if I tried to recreate the scenario of the book in my real life, which I am not. Um, and I guess we'll have to give a spoiler alert at some point. But yeah, I'm healthily obsessed with it in that I think it's an amazing book, not that I want to be like the characters.
Yeah.
I will say that.
If you wanted to be like some of these characters, I would have some concerns.
Right.
But yes, as you said, we are discussing Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, which was published back in 2012. Despite this, though, given the nature of this book specifically, spoiler warning is very much in effect. If you don't want to have a massive twist revealed to you, this is the part where you close this episode, read the book, and then come back. Or watch the movie. There is a pretty good movie adaptation as well. Just to get that out the way, the warning's there. Going forward, where there is no promise we will not give you big spoilers. In fact, we almost certainly will.
I am sure we will. It's pretty hard to talk about what makes this book so great without the spoilers. So, yeah, you have been warned.
As far as this book goes, why don't you introduce us to the book and maybe tell us a little bit about how you discovered it and ended up reading it and all that.
Sure. Okay. So, for maybe if it's been a while since for someone who's not read it in a while, it's about this married couple, Nick and Amy, and it's the day of their fifth wedding anniversary, and Amy disappears in very odd circumstances. And so I think I'll explain a little bit about how the book is set up because the first part, you go back and forth between Nick's point of view, the husband, where his wife is missing and he's trying to figure out what's going on. And then you get these diary entries from Amy, where it starts when they first met, and you're kind of getting the backstory of their marriage. And so I'll go ahead and we might as well say the spoiler is in the midway point, part two, you find out that Amy is framing her husband for her murder, and that this whole diary entries that you've been reading are a creation. She created this diary to mislead people into thinking their marriage was something that it wasn't. So I will just say, and there's obviously a whole lot more we will get into, but I will just say that I still remember. I don't remember how I picked up this book or who recommended it to me, but I remember the experience of reading it, and I remember being totally sucked in by the voice. You know, the voice of the Amy's diary has this very interesting voice, and the voice of Nick. But then when I got to that twist, it floored me. I think that's one of the reasons why Gone Girl was so popular was that twist of it's always like, oh, the husband's the murderer, or oh, there's a beautiful woman who's gone missing. There's a million thrillers where the beautiful woman is murdered or missing. And in this one, it's like, oh yeah, she's missing because she, took action for herself and made herself disappear and framed her husband for her murder. It's just um I I will say this. So I at the time I was not yet married to my husband. We were long distance. We were in a long distance relationship. And I remember that I had to go to pick him up from the airport. And I was sitting there reading while I was waiting for his plane to land. And I didn't want his plane to land because I wanted to keep reading. So, and we were still like in the, obsessed with each other honeymoon phase. So that tells you how good this book was. As I was like, oh man, I hope his plane is delayed so I can just keep reading this book.
There's a degree of irony in that, reading this book and having that feeling.
It was a little weird to be like, I don't think I told him what book I was reading because I was, we still were getting to know each other and we were still dating. And I think I was like, I don't know if I'm going to tell him that I'm reading this book because that might weird him out a little bit. I mean, now he knows that it's one of my favorite books, but yeah, so that's a little, reminder about the story and that it's really stuck with me. I've reread it several times. I've now seen the film twice. But yeah, I can keep going about what I love about it. But do you do you want to steer this in any particular direction?
Well, just as a point of comparison, I suppose, I read the book for the first time very recently, as we discussed for a little bit before we started recording.
Hmm.
And so I actually saw the movie first back in 20 something. When did the movie come out?
I want to say it came out in maybe 2015 or I think I saw it when it was in the movie theater and I want to say it was 2014, 2015.
2014, yeah.
Okay.
So I would have seen that not that long after it came out, but whilst but after it had come out of theaters, it was like streaming or on paid TV or whatever. And then I sort of went, I should read that book, and then I didn't up until you told me it was going to be this like we were going to do it for this episode, and I read it basically per your recommendation. Effectively, it spurred me into reading it, and I'm so very glad I did because
Yeah.
everything you've said about why it's great so far is bang on.
Yeah. I mean, it is really I think it's an experience and it is one of those books that I think you just think into. Like I was telling you, I think in my version it's like 700 some pages. Oh, and not that 559 pages, but still, you just like sink into it and these characters are so fascinating and their voices and their thoughts are so interesting that you just don't want it to end. You just want it to keep going. At least that's how I felt. So,
I do get it, but like you so quickly, even in those like very first chapters when you're hearing Nick's talking for the first time, basically talking to you for the first time, the character is so charismatic that
right.
you as the reader are drawn in to the way he is talking to you before you realize that you're especially and then Amy comes into the picture as well with her own distinct voices and is also an incredibly charismatic character, and the writing is such a the prose is so high quality that you
Yes.
end up enraptured long before the mystery starts unfolding.
Yes, I that's such a great point because I think the thing that makes this book so stand out is not only is it an incredible mystery, incredible twists, and incredible plotting, but Gillian Flynn's prose, her like she is top notch. Her writing is incredible. Um, and so yeah, so the I guess I'll say the other thing about the voices is it draws you in because it's that confessional tone, right? Which I love that in a book where, you've got Nick and it feels like he's being very confessional and confiding in us, the reader, as he tries to sort out what's going on. And then of course with Amy's diary, it's the same like confessional. We're getting like the inside peek, and they're both characters are writers. So, Nick is an ex-journalist who lost his job, and Amy used to write women's quizzes for women's magazines. So they're both incredible writers as their characters too. So like you said, it just draws you in, and you feel even though as time goes on you start to distrust them and maybe start to dislike them, you still feel charmed and intrigued by them.
They are fascinating. They're fascinating characters. They're both terrible people, but
Yes.
sometimes, but it's like sometimes you just want to watch the train crash.
Right. Well, I was thinking about it and I was like, the thing is, you kind of are rooting for both of them, even though they are terrible people, because, well, first of all, in the first half of the book, you're not really sure what's going on. You kind of believe Nick that he didn't kill Amy, but you're trying to figure out what's going on. But then by the halfway mark, he didn't kill her. So you are kind of rooting for like, well, he really didn't murder her. He shouldn't go to, because as it starts ramping up, it starts seeming like he has murdered her. And so you're rooting for him of like, well, he's innocent of that. He's not a great person. He was, we find out, cheating on Amy and with a much younger woman. So he's not a good person, but he's not a murderer. So you're rooting for him. But then on the other hand, Amy is so freaking clever. And you're like, wow, she did a lot of work to frame Nick for her murder. And she really thought of everything. So then you kind of want her to get away with it too, And it's like, well, you can't have both. So it's very interesting that even though you're like, these are
Well, you
both
say that, but
terrible
you
people.
actually kind of do get both by the end, and it's the
That's
worst case
true.
scenario.
That's very true. And that's also, I think, such an interesting way to end it of like, how is this going to end? Because yeah, you're like, well, either Amy's going to get caught or Nick's going to, go to prison for something he didn't commit. And then it's like this third option that you didn't think of that's like, oh, that's dark. Right?
Yes, it's like, wow, this is somehow they're both getting what they wanted out of this is actually the worst possible thing that could happen.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, isn't that what you're supposed to do with thrillers and mysteries in general? Is, you're supposed to make readers oscillating between, well, is it going to be this? Is it this person? Is it this person? And then it's this third option that you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even see that. So again, her plotting and her twists are incredible.
I get the feeling that Gillian Flynn is a very genre savvy writer. She is
Yes.
very, very aware of all the tropes and conventions and audience expectations and knows how to use those against you as the reader, which sounds very confrontational and mean-spirited, but it's the best way I could think of explaining it. She actively uses what she knows you would expect to her advantage to make the story more interesting and engaging and twisty and captivating. And what's very cool is so do her narrators in this story.
Yeah, I was going to say, so one of the things, and I know that there have been unreliable narrators before Gillian Flynn. Obviously, she didn't come up with the idea of the unreliable narrator, but I do think she does it so well. So I'll give an example of Nick where, he, like you said, right away kind of charms us. We're rooting for him. He's trying to figure out what happened to his wife. And there's little hints along the way, like he's got this burner phone. We know something, it's like, okay, he's doing something shady, but we don't know what. And
And
he
he
even
introduces it
says,
so casually too.
he introduces it so casually, and then he'll make these little remarks like, that was the third lie I gave to the police, or something like that. And it's kind of like this throwaway line, and you're like, huh, what was that all about? And then it's not until I want to say a third of the way through the book that you find out that it's like you feel like he's been lying to you, the reader, because you're like, you find out he's been sleeping with this college age girl for the past year. And you're like,
It's basically when she shows up, he's like, "Oh yeah, by the way, I should probably mention this, and then you can decide you don't like me."
right, right. And it's like, and I think that Gillian Flynn as the author did that very intentionally to like hold out for a long time so that we would like him. And now we're like, we feel like our trust has been broken. And it's sort of the same thing like with Amy, where you're starting to like her through her diary. And then you find out, oh, it's all just totally been faked. And you're like, wait, oh, well, now I can't trust you either. And, I think Gillian Flynn said that this was kind of, she wanted to play with the idea of marriage and sort of a he said she said, and you do get that where it's like sort of back and forth between Nick and Amy. Who do we trust? Whose version of the truth do we trust? And then at a certain point you're like, oh my gosh, we can't trust either of them. But we still want to find out what's going to happen next
Yeah,
you know
it's interesting because the characters are doing to you as the reader the exact same thing that they're doing to each other.
Oh, that's so smart. Because, okay, so after I finished reading the book, I like read back some interviews of Gillian Flynn around the time when the book came out and some reviews. And she said something like, marriage is like a long con because you meet this person and you put forth your best self and you try to be their dream girl or dream guy. And it's not until you've been married a while and your flaws start to come out and you can't be that person all the time around them anymore. And yet now you've already committed to loving this other person, warts and all. And so she was kind of playing with that concept with Nick and Amy, but you're right that it's the same experience we're having. We kind of, get invested in Nick and Amy up front, and then it turns out they've been conning us. So that's very interesting.
It speaks volumes to their character, not as characters, but as in universe as people, and breaking that fourth wall a bit, interacting with the reader. It shows you consistency, right? It shows you that
Mm-hmm.
they're not just terrible like this to each other. This is who they are as people. And I think that's
Right.
a really nice touch that it works this way. And they don't even lie to you in the same way as each other.
Right. Right.
Nick outright says he favors the lie of omission.
Mm-hmm.
He leaves stuff out and tells you all the good bits, shows you his best side, frames himself kind of as the victim, acknowledges the lesser flaws while sweeping the bigger ones under the rug, and then over time starts to slowly drip feed the truth to you.
Right.
Whereas Amy is a lot more stubborn than Nick, a lot more put together and pragmatic and practical. She has figured out every detail and drops the facade when she wants to. Everything is calculated. It's not that
Right.
slow drip feed. She, from the very beginning, has completely fabricated this massive story and sticks to it right up until till she decides she doesn't need to, and then she drops the veil all at once.
Right. Yeah, I think Amy is a lot she is totally fine with kind of obliterating the truth and creating an entirely new truth that then she, almost starts to believe herself. Whereas Nick is, yeah, more the kind of lie of omission and, oh, I just want to, like you said, show my best side to people. Yeah, yeah, I mean, as characters, they're fascinating. Their voices are fascinating. I really liked the distinction between, you're reading Amy's diary entries, which are kind of meant to show this progression towards Nick as becoming an abusive husband, right? Which but she uses a lot of true things from their marriage and then also makes up some straight up lies. But the voice, she has this very particular kind of peppy, I even wrote down like one of her diary entries starts with tra and la, right? She's like
Yeah.
very peppy and has this certain voice, and then we switch when we find out what's actually going on. She's much more cold and pragmatic and not this, peppy diary Amy. That was just a character she created, right?
The funniest thing about that whole situation, right, is she says, I've crafted this character of the preppy, bubbly, high energy, haha, tra la la Amy, because I know that's gonna make me more likable. And I'm reading this going, I would hate you.
Well, that's true. On on multiple reads of this, I'm like, I'm not sure why Amy thinks that people would like this diary Amy because she's not that likable, but then it's what Amy thinks would be likable, I guess.
Oh,
You know.
it's not that she's like comes across as a bad person, Diary Amy, or anything like that. She comes across as a sort of very naive, good person.
Mhm.
But that constant high energy, super bubbly, everything so over the top is exactly the kind of person that I just cannot be in a room with for more than 15 minutes.
Well, what was your experience? I guess you already knew the twist. So what was your experience in reading the book? Because I feel like that's one of the things in the film, they really can't do that in the film. They can't have, Diary Amy's voice in the film. So yeah. So when you read the book, were you like, oh, huh, what's going on?
I think that yeah, the book does a because it's has this confessional tone. It's always in that sort of a first person kind of perspective where a film really can't be, and you get so much more of their inner thoughts, which is very
Hmm.
hard to do in a film.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And I think,
I think it works better in the book.
yeah,
I have to admit,
yeah, yeah.
Diary
Yeah, I
Amy
think in
certainly
the
comes across more.
I think in the film they have a little bit of voiceover from Nick, but yeah, obviously you don't get any of the diary Amy.
Not in, I think, yeah, you do get some voiceover from Amy, I think. I
Oh,
watched it this
okay.
morning. You'd think I'd remember this, but no, I'm really tired. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, you get little patches of narration as you often do when films adapt very like narration heavy books, but especially when first
Hmm.
person ones. Like Shawshank does it, for example, and so many others do. But you can't have constant narration, the inner thoughts of someone's head all the time, the same way as you
Right.
can in a book.
Right.
So
And I think that is what makes this book so much fun. So, yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely an
Um,
advantage.
so okay, so I'm looking through my notes about things that I loved, and we've talked about a lot of it. So like the unreliable narrators, the unlikable but fascinating characters, the twists, and we talked about flipping the script on kind of these common tropes. I also love the irony of that Amy, who at the beginning we think is this victim, is the one who ends up being the murderer, not her husband. Like she doesn't murder Nick, but she murders someone else. And I'm like, it's all so delicious because it takes those tropes and just totally goes in a different direction than readers have expected from all the millions of other thrillers,
Yeah,
you know.
subversion of expectations is a very powerful tool in the author's arsenal, especially when it's done well.
Yeah, actually, so I'm actually trying to revise a thriller novel right now. I go back and forth between whether I'm calling it suspense or thriller, but I I know that the draft I have now, I have a first draft, and I know that some of the things are too on the nose or like, I feel like I need to kind of take some of my twists and brainstorm, okay, what are the readers going to expect? Now let me come up with like three different things that they're not going to expect. Or, like I need to just like really dig into how I can surprise the readers, which is hard because Gillian Flynn's already done this, so I can't do this.
I mean, the book even actually, Nick laments this at one point in the book, even. This idea that his was the last generation to experience anything for the first time,
Mm,
or
mm-hmm.
something along those lines. And I don't completely agree with that sentiment, but there is a grain of truth to it that the we were in an era where there is so much media that is so readily available and commentary on all that media circulates so quickly. That's partly
Mm-hmm.
why you have so many people get so angry about spoilers because it's so hard to avoid them now.
Yeah, that's a good point of something else that this book does. And of course it's a little dated now, but Nick as a journalist who lost his job because, obviously I think this was set in like 2008, 2009, something like that. And so many publications were going online or folding and he has a lot to say about, the world of journalism and the world of story and a lot of kind of cynical views. But yeah, it's true. If we're even just talking about tropes, we live in such a time now where it's like, I was just reading an article. I think the title of the article is "Did this best-selling romantasy author steal another author's work?" or something like that. And it was like a copyright lawsuit case, but they were like, it's so hard now to prove that someone stole your work because so many things are so trope heavy and it's like, oh, we're just recycling the same ideas over and over again and with a slightly different setting or whatever, yeah, so I mean I don't know that I agree that there's nothing new, um but there is a lot of recycling of the
Yeah,
same old tropes, you know.
the idea that there's nothing new, that I find it very hard to believe no one is ever going to come up with another original idea. I also find it very hard to believe that no one's ever going to come up with a more original spin on a previous idea because every author has their own voice and experience that's going to color their writing. So I don't completely agree with Nick, but definitely do get where he's coming from. And I do
Yeah.
think it's very pertinent to what you were saying before. What you were saying before reminds me of that writing exercise of start by writing all the things that isn't. the conclusion to this scene or this book or whatever, and then
Mm-hmm.
you'll be left only with the more fresh ideas.
Right. Well, they always say, your first idea is usually not your best idea because it's the idea you've seen somewhere or it's the most common thing that anyone would think of off the top of their head. And so it's like you have to dig underneath the first idea to get to all of those less common. I was even like driving in the car today and I was like, I need to just entertain the most absurd, outlandish, answers to the mystery in my for this novel of like, well, what if it's this? Okay, that's crazy, but still, let's not be quick to, you know, send it packing because we don't want the most obvious.
Yeah, I find myself wondering what like a writer like Gillian Flynn, who is so genre savvy and so good at pulling off a twist, would think of one of the sort of schools of thought I find myself subscribing to, which is that it's kind of okay to just give people what they expect sometimes, because you can use that to your advantage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something that I've developed a little bit of a habit of doing is being quite transparent with how something is going to go and then just doing it and just building up to this horrible bad thing and because that you can use that to like build a sense of dread.
Right. Yeah, it's like, well, like you said, it's like the car crash you can't look away from.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a really good point because I think, there are certain genres where, and I don't read romance, but I know that in romance, it's like, there better be a happily ever after, or you're going to have a mutiny on your hands. And like people are like going on TikTok being like, I want it to be friends to lovers. I want it to be just one bed for two people or whatever. Again, I don't read the romance, but I know all the tropes. And it's like, it literally is like we give the people what we want, and if that's their comfort read or that's their happy place. And I do think with thrillers, I personally get very annoyed when it's twists just for the sake of twists and they don't really make sense, or like I get to the end and I'm like, okay, well, I didn't see that coming because it's completely off the wall and like doesn't make any sense. Like, I don't want that. I'd
No.
rather have it be what I thought it was and be like, oh, I figured it out, than to have it be like, turns out it was this guy. And I'm like,
Who?
why did I, read this whole thing? So it is like, I think you're right that in some ways, giving people what they want is better than coming up with some crazy plot twist that is going to be frustrating.
Which is
Yeah.
that's one of the things that's really interesting about this about Gone Girl though, is because the twist it doesn't quite come out of nowhere because there is a gradual build up as more of Nick's flaws start revealing themselves and the sort of scenario gets built up that Amy's setting up and things like that. But the twist is quite a big blindside, all things considered, and it's only works because of the unreliable narrator, right? I mean,
Right.
obviously, but I mean the impact. Can you imagine if this twist, if it was this twist, and that, but also Nick was not shitty at all. He was telling you the truth the whole time. It would have fallen so flat. But because they're both horrible people
Right.
who are
Right.
lying to you actively, it works to blindside you like this.
Well, and I think this is one of those books that I personally, as soon as I finished it, I was like, oh, I'm going to need to reread that because we haven't even talked about the treasure hunt.
Oh yeah.
But the treasure, so every year, Amy does this anniversary treasure hunt for Nick with clues. And so she has created the treasure hunt this year and she's gone missing, but the first clue is there. And so basically, while the investigation is going on to find her, police are saying to Nick, well, you better do the treasure hunt because it'll give us information about, her last steps before she went missing. And so as he's doing the treasure hunt, he thinks the clues mean one thing. But then we realize along with Nick that all of the clues are basically poking at the fact that she knows he's been cheating on her. And so it's like they all have this double meaning and you realize that she started planning this whole thing a year ago when she saw it, it happened to be the first time he ever, slept with Andy, but she happened to see it or see them together. And so I don't think, I think Gillian Flynn has planted all the clues. And, once you know what's going on and you go back and reread, you're like, oh my gosh, like she knew about Nick cheating, and also all of the clues in the treasure hunt prove, like, it's hard to explain how they do this, but they all kind of further entrench him in seeming guilty to her murder. So it's like she's thought of everything. And like, yeah, I think on second read you realize like, okay, this really isn't coming out of nowhere. Gillian Flynn has put in all of the clues. And it's just that, we the readers were as clueless as Nick basically and didn't pick up on them the first time. So it's all just extremely clever. It's just so
It
clever.
is. My favorite thing about the treasure hunt, right, is that not only is it has this double meanings with the whole relating to his cheating with Andy. Not only does every clue in some way that his finding it is engineered to make him look more suspicious,
Mm-hmm.
but it tells us a lot about how calculating and clever and insightful Amy is. And when you think back on it, it should have been obvious, not obvious, but the first hint that something unusual is going on is in the treasure hunt right at the beginning when Nick opens it and solves it and goes, she's going easy on me this year. Every other year,
Mm-hmm.
I've not made it past two. The first one has taken me hours. I made it up to two once. And you don't even think about that. It doesn't register because you're still in the, oh my God, his wife has gone missing. Oh no. It doesn't even click that one of the biggest disputes they always have is that she does this thing and he doesn't like it really. And to be quite frank, he's right about what it is. It's a test,
Mm-hmm.
it's a quiz to see how dedicated he is to her. I do completely agree with that assessment, but that it's right there, and that first hint that something's different about this one, and
Yeah,
and you never
yeah.
even think about it.
And then it's that like I'm glad you brought up that line because then it's like this very ironic line of he's kind of delighted. He's like, oh, I know this one. Oh,
Yeah,
she's going easy on me this time. And it's like, oh, the irony. She's going the hardest she has ever gone on you this time, But yeah, and it also kind of echoes. So I hadn't even thought about how it's like a quiz, like Amy writes the quizzes for the magazines. So
oh
it
yeah,
is like it's
yeah,
like a quiz for Nick, but it's also like a whose perspective matters, like should Nick remember things, or Amy wants Nick to remember things exactly the way she does. Amy wants Nick's memories of their marriage to be exactly like hers, and it's just kind of all mixed in there of marriage and whose side do we see. And I think, yeah, it's all just, I feel like I don't know how long it took her to write this book, but I just feel like it's all so clever and everything is kind of all entangled
yeah.
in
This,
a really interesting
yeah,
way.
a pantsed book. This was not.
No, certainly not. Um, yeah. So, well, I wonder if also, okay, so tomorrow I'm actually teaching a class on amazing first pages, and I always use Gone Girl as an example, and I'm wondering if I can just read a little bit of the first page because it's also one of the things I really love about this book, and is that okay?
Yeah, you
I
could
can
read
talk
as
about it.
much as you want without getting me in copyright trouble.
Okay. Well, so I'm gonna skip a little bit because I there's the one part in particular I want to talk about. So it starts with an in Nick's perspective, and he has kind of this almost creepy monologue where he's talking about when he thinks of his wife, he always thinks of her
Yes,
head, which I think is how the film starts too.
it is ex almost word for word.
Yeah. And so that in itself, I think, is kind of tone setting where we're like, that's weird. He's kind of talking about her like he loves her, but also maybe he wants to kill her. Like he's talking about the shape of her skull and her brain. So it
It's just
is,
weirdly poetic, I think. But
yeah, it's like, it's weirdly poetic in kind of a odd way. But so, okay, so this is the part that I wanted to read. So then we get a little break and then it says, My eyes flipped open at exactly 6 a.m. This was no avian flutter of the lashes, no gentle blink towards consciousness. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So he's waking up, and then he says, at that exact moment, 6:00, the sun climbed over the skyline of Oaks, revealing its full summer angry god self. Its reflection flared across the river towards our house, a long, blaring finger aimed at me through our frail bedroom curtains, accusing, you have been seen. You will be seen. So I always use this as an example because I'm like, okay, we always hear, do not start your book with a person waking up, right? And of course, she's done it here. Like it basically starts with Nick waking up the day of their anniversary, but it's like
Sorry, I
the
just
word.
realized
Yeah.
not the prologue, but chapter one of my book does in fact open with a character waking up.
Oh no. Well, but see, here's an example of like you can do it, but you've got to like so the thing I think is so interesting is it's like, okay, he's waking up, but like the word choice of like it's a sunny day outside, right? But instead he's like the sun is an angry god. It's like flaring across the river with a long blaring finger. So you're like immediately like okay, he feels guilty about something, right? He feels like the sun is pointing a finger at him. And you don't really understand what he's feeling guilty about until way later, right? But it's I feel like does such a good job of setting the tone just with her word choice of like it's just a guy waking up in the morning with the sun outside, but we get this very foreboding sense that like something is not right. And even like later on, he goes downstairs and she's like making crepes or something, and he like gets a sick feeling in his stomach, and you're like, and you realize later, I think he's nervous about I think he's actually thinking about asking her for a divorce. I think you find
Correct.
out later. Yeah. And so that's what he's nervous about. But you're like, dude, it's your anniversary. Your beautiful wife is making you crepes. Like, what's your deal? So it just kind of immediately gives you that sense of foreboding, that sense of like something is.
It's the contrast. He's woken up.
Yes.
It's a beautiful day. The sun is shining, and he hates it. It makes him feel like he's being watched. He describes the sun as an angry god, which I like that. I always enjoy the sun being personified as like some eldritch
Yes.
horror. And then an even stronger contrast moments later, he goes downstairs and his wife is there and it's a very homely, cozy scene. She's in a good mood, high spirits. She's making crepes
Mm-hmm.
and it's their anniversary. These are all things that should be happy. And he's describing how it makes him feel awful. And
Right.
he has this mounting sense of dread, and you're like, there is clearly something not right in this marriage.
Yeah, I think you're right about the contrast. And that I almost feel like I mentioned this to you the last time, but maybe not. That one of my favorite writing exercises, I think I did mention this to you, is to either write about a terrible thing happening in a beautiful
In
place
fact, you did.
or or write about yeah, but it's exactly or write about a wonderful thing happening in a horrible place. But yeah, it's exactly what you're saying is it's that contrast is so interesting. So, it would be one thing if like he woke up and it was a gray, horrible, rainy day and like, Amy was sitting at the table eating Cheerios or whatever. But like, yeah, that contrast is so
That's
interesting.
that because that's what your instinct is. It's to use the weather as metaphor and symbolism, things like
Mm-hmm.
that. It's to set this atmosphere of, oh, it's a dreary day. He struggles to get out of bed. He's woken up at like lunchtime and it's gloomy. But no, he's woken up bright and early. It's bright and sunny, happy day. Wife's making crepes. And because of that, the fact that he feels so bad about all these generally positive things is already a massive sort of subversion of expectation. And
Yes.
already that there's that contrast which puts you on edge, not in a typical thriller sense or horror sense or anything like
Mm-hmm.
that, but you get this immediate sense of something is not right here. It's very
I
well
think
done. It's a fantastic opening to a book.
so. There's another podcast I listen to. It's called The Shit No One Tells You About Writing. And they do these
It's a
like,
very good title.
yeah, yeah, it's a great podcast. And they always talk about, they often will critique first pages and they talk about planting curiosity seeds, which is basically, you just putting things in the first few pages that are going to make your reader want to keep reading. But I think this is an example of curiosity seeds where it's not like we're confused and we don't know what's going on. Like we know he's woken up, he's going downstairs, it's the anniversary, but we're curious because we're like, why does he feel this way? Like what's going on? That's, I don't know. So I think it's a good job of making us curious. Because I do feel like as a writing instructor, I see that a lot where people will be like, oh, if I leave stuff out and I'm really, vague, then people will be like, what's going on? And they'll keep reading. But it's a fine line, right? You want people to understand what's happening. You don't want them to be confused, but you do want them to be curious and have those like curiosity seeds, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I mean, in very Nick Dunn fashion, she's told us a bunch of information that is going to get our attention and start setting things up to be portraying him in a certain way, and Amy less so, honestly, at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To get us invested and curious, and then all the bad things are drip fed to us over time.
Right. Which I guess, is kind of what Gillian Flynn was saying about marriage, right?
Exactly.
You meet someone, they're charming, they seem awesome, and like slowly over time you find out all of
Yeah,
the flaws about them.
that constant theme or trend is it's between all the characters, it's between the characters and us as an audience as well. It's also between Gillian Flynn as the writer and us as the audience. It is a consistent through line throughout the story, and
Hmm.
it's always good when a theme gets hammered into you like that without it being stupidly overt.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think even Nick's sister says to him about Andy, the young girl that he's having the affair with, is she's like, because I think he's thinking about divorcing Amy to
Yeah,
be with Andy, right? And she's like, Nick, as soon as you're actually with her full time, she's not going to be perfect anymore. You're going to start to see all of her flaws. And, and then and it's true that once he kind of decides that he's got to end things with her because it will look really suspicious, in this investigation, he finds like, oh, he doesn't miss her as much as he thought. Like she's more of just an ideal, and if he was with her full time, he would see all the flaws. And yeah, so it's that theme coming back again.
that's how relationships go in general, isn't it? It's this idea of you meet each other when you're at your best. You want
Mm-hmm.
people you try and keep that going for as long as you can, and eventually you either keep it up till you fall apart or things start gradually loosening up because you get more comfortable, more of the bad stuff starts to show. And in the end, all it becomes is a question of is the good stuff worth the bad stuff? You can,
Right.
like, it sounds very pragmatic, but you really can math out any relationship, platonic, romantic, whatever, under those exact same equation. And Amy sucks at that. She can't do it. She cannot accept less than perfect. And neither can Nick, to be fair. But
I mean, to come right out and say it, like, it's pretty clear to me that Amy is a sociopath. Like, and I think even more so in the book
I would
because,
I think she's more like I would honestly say she's more of a psychopath.
okay, psychopath.
Yeah.
I'm not 100% clear on the difference between the two.
Well,
So,
one of them is an actual psychological like condition. It is when you can't really do empathy
mm,
is like the main hallmark. You tend to be
hmm,
kind of self-absorbed and things like that as well, but that's amazing. Sociopath is not a actual diagnosis, but it is a sort of general discussion, like descriptor of an inability to function normally in society is the best way my sleep-deprived brain is describing it. It's not a very good description, but
okay. Well, listeners, do
yeah,
your own research later. But okay, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and say, especially given the fact that she like coldly murdered a person to further her own con. Yeah, she's a psychopath, like we'll just go ahead and say, like, and especially I think in the book, so in the film they don't get into her history where she has sort of
not
done
nearly as
similar
much. It's
things,
kind of
right?
like it's in there, but not to the same extent.
But not, yeah, not to the same extent. So then when you start to see, oh, she has a pattern and like she does not like being wrong, she does not like being made a fool of, which of course with Nick cheating on her, that's what's happened. And she will dole out. I mean, she is the angry god doling out the punishment, right? So yeah, so
Yeah,
she's,
I
I
mean,
mean,
I respect revenge, but that's a really disproportionate revenge.
yeah. So I mean, I think, you know, Nick is not a great guy, but Amy is straight up psychotic sometimes. So it's but of course that's what makes her so interesting. But then to your point, I think what was so revolutionary. I mean, I think there were many revolutionary things about this novel. One, just that it was so literary, but also such a page-turning thriller. I think the fact that she was framing Nick for her murder, this big twist, but then also the ending where I mean, they essentially decide that they are gonna. At first, Nick doesn't want to stay with her. He's like, "You're crazy, and you tried to frame me for your murder."
And
But then
she's like, "Yep."
she's like, "Yeah, wasn't I so smart? Aren't you impressed?" You know.
And he's like,
But then
"Yes, wait, no, yes, but bad."
But then he finds out that she's pregnant with his child and he's always wanted a kid. And then
Which,
essentially,
not to cut you off, but as a side note, is something she has engineered specifically to manipulate him into staying,
yes,
so
exactly,
she can
exactly.
go through the process of molding him into the perfect Nick all over again.
Right, right. And so then, yeah, and then essentially, you know, they stay together both for the kid, like staying together for the kid, and they also are essentially agreeing to pretend. And basically like Nick's like, "Okay, I'll be the Nick you want me to be. I'll be this perfect husband." And Amy's like, "Okay, well, and I'll be, you know, the perfect crate making wife." And we're, you know, I feel like it's such a dark, I think that was Gillian Flynn's intention, was this very dark commentary on marriage of like two people basically being like, okay, we'll agree to pretend. I mean, I'm not saying that's all marriages, but I think that was kind of her commentary. And I think that was also something that was very different about this book, is like nobody is the winner or the loser here. They're both kind of they both kind of lose and they both kind of win.
I mean, I think when you write a story, most stories, you have a choice to make come the end, where you can choose the everyone's going to be happy, the most satisfying ending, or you could choose to make a point.
Right. Yeah.
And neither of those things is the right choice or the wrong choice. It depends entirely on what you are aiming to do. And I think Gillian Flynn was very much wanted to make a point. She wanted to very much say, if you are in a situation, a marriage, a friendship, early days relationship, whatever, keeping this mask on and try to be the perfect version of you, this idealized version of you that you think other people want you to be, is never going to be healthy.
It's not going to work out in the end.
No,
Yeah.
like something is going to go catastrophically wrong. And that's what Margot is there for. She tells Nick that that is going to happen, and that it's destroying her to see it because she is aware. She's looking from the outside. She's just seen all this mess go on and been almost swept up in herself. She recognizes that this is going to be very bad. And we are
Right.
left with that knowledge and then not told what happens, just to imagine what horrendous shit's gonna happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I guess we haven't talked much about Margot, but she is, I think, an important character in that she is sort of the voice of reason and she's the sounding board. And I think she's also what helps us to trust Nick too. Um and and when, you know, when we the reader find out that he's been cheating is the same point in time where she finds out, and it's like she's kind of heartbroken and her trust has been broken as well. So, you know, I think you could probably have this book without her, but she's very helpful.
I'm glad that they don't though, because she is my favorite character.
She's a yeah, she's a good character. And you know, I liked her in the film too. It's interesting. I felt like, and I know maybe we're not supposed to talk about the acting of the films, but I feel like Rosamund Pike in the film is kind of plays Amy in this creepy way where you're like, okay, well, yeah,
Oh
because
no,
she is
you're allowed to talk about the acting in this one.
okay, okay. But I think that I mean, I guess it's fine, but I think the thing that in the book is that it's much easier to let her creepiness and her, you know, kind of psychotic nature come out slowly over time. Whereas I feel like in the movie, almost kind of right away, you're like, there's something off about this woman,
Is
you
it?
know?
I think partially that was done on purpose, right? Because you have the window into her mind in the false diary Amy's mind, she
Mm-hmm.
comes across a lot more believable. But
Mm-hmm.
she's so over the top peppy and things like that that she would come off as like watching her played without the narration, without the diary perspective, without being in her head. Seeing someone play that character in this movie would have felt tonally inconsistent and would have
Yeah, I think that's
made
true.
us, well, it would have thrown something off with the atmosphere, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true. Well, I don't know. Let me look and see if there's anything else I want to talk about. I mean, I think the only thing we haven't touched on is the setting, which
Or
I
social
think,
commentary, that's in there.
and the social commentary. Yeah, because I thought it was a very good choice. And I mean, this is also something for, writers trying to figure out how to set the tone for their novel is that, the setting can do so much to set the tone and that, Nick and Amy they met in New York City, they were living there, but then they both lost their jobs and they have to move to this small town. Is it in Missouri? I
It's
want to
in
say.
Missouri, yes.
Yeah, the small town in Missouri, and it's one of these dying towns where there's this huge mall that is completely empty and like, you know, there's drug addicts hanging out there. And then they are living in this neighborhood of like empty houses. All these houses got built during the bubble and then never sold. And so, first of all, it's like it's a very convenient setting for a thriller because there's almost no one living in the neighborhood. So, like, if no one could hear her scream, sort of thing. But also, it just sets this very kind of creepy vibe from the get-go of like this dying town, these giant empty houses, this, derelict mall. And yeah, so I mean, it certainly would have worked, I think, anywhere, but the setting just does gives us that extra oomph of tone.
It's also ties in nicely with how she's manipulating audience expectations and things like that, because that sort of there's a phrase to it for it. It's like not small town, it's small town sort of Americana horror kind of
Mm,
aesthetic. So she's already setting us up to just with that description as well, with the setting, to buy into the tropes and the conventions that are tied to that setting, which is very good.
mm-hmm.
But two things I really like about the setting and the use of the setting. The first is something I've actually talked about on the other podcast a fair bit recently. Not for episodes that are out yet, mind you, although by the time this comes out, they might be. Timing's getting a
Okay.
little weird on this one. Uh, but is this idea that setting is really important to the characters.
Mm-hmm.
Characters should always be shaped by their backgrounds and the environments they exist in and have existed in the past. And I think that Gillian Flynn, with her writing of Nick and Amy, is very aware of this and does a very good job with this. Amy is from a very wealthy only child upbringing with two parents who are conniving and manipulative, I'm going to be honest,
Yep.
and very
Yep.
pragmatic and use their relationship with their daughter basically to fund their business.
Mm-hmm.
It's all towards this business of theirs effectively. And she's grown up constantly compared to this book character, which has set this mindset from an early age of I have to like be perfect. I not only be perfect, I have to be perfect, but then also I deserve perfect.
Right.
All of that
Yeah.
has come like from all that upbringing and all that from an early age. And then conversely, you have Nick, who has grown up in sort of rural US, which in a fairly with this awful abusive man as his husband in a very traditional kind of part of the US, where so he's grown up having very clear views of what gender roles are supposed to be. And even though he does, like, even the parts of him that try and actively work against it because he's aware of it, it's still very ingrained in him. He wants this traditional nuclear family where he fills one role and where Amy fills another, which is very much not what she has grown up to want and expect, and that is already setting them up for disaster because that's something they're going to have to work through if they want to not end up where they actually end up. But also, it's the same thing. The setting is the same problem as Nick and Amy. They had this wonderful town. It was built up to be this amazing place. Everything was booming. There was this fancy new mall built, and all this was going to be the next big thing. And then the bubble popped, and now look at it.
Oh my gosh, I didn't see it that way, but that is so true. It's that facade that then comes crumbling down. Yeah, totally.
Even the whole situation with the Amazing Amy series, it's also the same thing. This built up to be this amazing, perfect thing, and then it started falling apart over time with each new installment.
Right.
Same thing
Yeah.
there as well.
Yeah. Oh, so smart. It's so smart. Yeah. I was gonna say something else about the small town, but I can't remember. But it is, I mean, I think she does a good job of kind of weaving in their backstory so we kind of understand their psychology. And, Nick's used to being, he grew up in a small town. He's a good looking guy, I think, sporty and stuff like that. And so he was used to being a big fish in a small pond. Like he was used to being the golden boy who could do no wrong. And so he kind of feels like he justifies all of the terrible things he's doing to himself because he's never kind of had to answer to anything before. And so Amy is kind of his first experience of having to own up to his own flaws, I think, which is interesting. So,
And so very ironic.
mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, the irony here is deep and delicious.
And it
And
goes both ways.
yeah, yeah, I think that's true. So it's just, yeah, it's fascinating. Well, I don't know. Do you want to say anything? So I like because there is definitely social commentary here.
Oh yeah,
Um,
no, I'm always willing to get into the social commentary.
all right, why don't you tell me what you picked up on and I'll see if I have anything to add.
So, one thing that I noticed in your notes, especially, right, is that you talked. I mean, the dying state of journalism, actually, I'm going to start with that because that's probably going to be a lot less of a hot button topic.
Right.
But I like that you mentioned that because it's the same. It's this thing going on again where what is happening in their lives and in the world around them is mirrored by what is going on with their relationship in a lot of ways. Not just in the sense of it looked like this wonderful thing that was going to go forever and then all the flaws started showing and it crumpled and died, but also because of what a lot of modern journalism has become and was becoming at the point of time this book was being written, probably. Which I'm sure, as someone who used to work writing for magazines and things like that, Gillian Flynn was very aware of,
Yes. Uh-huh.
is this idea that journalism has become less and less about the truth and more about presenting a very specific narrative to appeal to a specific audience to get them to keep picking up the magazine, opening the blog, reading the newspaper, watching the channel, tuning into Fox. I mean, what?
Yes, exactly. Yes, that is exactly true. It's not about the truth, it's about the story you're telling. And Nick is telling a story, Amy is telling a story. When Nick starts mounting his defense or kind of he gets a lawyer and the lawyer's like, we've got to get on top of the story. We've got to take control of the narrative. And yeah, it kind of gets into this all the sensational journalism that now that, magazines are dying, we need clickbait, you know. So yeah, it's all very interesting. And of course, Nick is coming at it from this very traditional, you know, school of journalism where he's very cynical about it. And I did think it was interesting because his job now in the book is he teaches a journalism course at the community college, which is where he meets Andy. And he at first thought he was going to go in and be honest and be like, look, this is what the industry this is what's happening in the industry, but instead he can't do it. And he just ends up, talking about I don't know, the glory days of journalism and answering all of their gaga questions. And it's like
He paints a pretty picture and does the exact same thing that is happening to journalism.
right, right. And meanwhile, I'm like, oh, children, go study something else. Don't don't get into journalism. Um, I don't know. I shouldn't say that. There's still plenty of good jobs for journalists, but it is certainly different than it was. And I think the way Nick was teaching his course, he was teaching it as if it were still the way it had been, you know.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Yeah, that's very
He didn't want
interesting.
to be. He was kind of enjoying reliving his glory days vicariously
Exactly.
through those lessons. Yeah.
Yep.
I
Yeah.
I don't have a lot to say about the housing bubble beyond what I already said. Because I know that's in your notes under social commentary. For anyone who's wondering why I just brought that up, because I feel
Yeah.
like we've already touched on like why the housing bubble collapse, popping, whatever you want to call it, kind of ties into the story thematically and stuff like that, and the death of the small town and things like that. Sort of how that ties up in there as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know I had the patriarchy in there too. Um,
Oh,
but I think I put
that's the one I'm excited for.
yeah, that well, and I think that that's the other thing is when I feel like, and I'd have to go back and look at other articles from this time, but I feel like when this book came out, people were really seeing it as almost like a feminist, feminist work of like, here is a woman taking charge of her life. And I mean, in an extreme, unhealthy way.
Yeah, the problem is she's
But
also taking charge of everyone else's.
right, right. Like, I do not think that Amy is a feminist icon, but I will say that the thing, and this is what I mentioned up at the top, the thing that was so exciting about this book was taking the trope of, oh, the beautiful woman has been murdered. The beautiful woman has been kidnapped. The beautiful woman is lying dead in a ditch somewhere. It takes that trope and it puts a very like, I don't know if feminist is the right word, but it takes Amy is very empowered. She is not lying dead in a ditch. She has orchestrated this entire thing and she's in control. And I don't know if you want to call it feminist, but it is certainly taking that idea of the woman as the victim and turning it on its head. So I don't know what you call that, but it's interesting.
I I see. I do think it's true because Amy herself has a lot to say about gender roles and feminism and patriarchy. Not always using those exact words and terms, which honestly I think it's a good thing. I'm probably getting some flack for saying this, but what the hell? Let's go for it.
Go for it.
I
Yeah.
hate the use of the term patriarchy. Not because I'm a man and therefore have a bias, although I'm sure I do have a degree of it, but because I think it's very misleading about the problem. Because
Okay.
it paints this idea of some masculine conspiracy where all the every man is tied up in this idea of this shadow government of the world, and it's not what it is. It is a much more systemic problem than that. It is the fact we exist in a society that is still built functionally on a lot of very outdated expectations and ideals, and a very small subset of primarily men manipulate that system to their advantage, which screws over a lot of people, including most other men. So I feel like the problem with the term patriarchy is that it paints this very inaccurate view of things, this very that's easy to get angry about because it almost creates an actual enemy. But
Mm-hmm.
I think what it also painting that picture, whilst it does make it certain some people get up in arms, it also alienates a lot of men from trying to solve the problem.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think it's like you said, it's not some conspiracy that all men are in on. It's a cultural, it's the way, our society has been set up.
Yeah.
And it's very, it's very difficult to change culture. So
I definitely
yeah.
think there's definitely like to be clear for the audience, there is very much a problem that we need to like with how we view power and gender and a lot of other intertwined things that very much needs fixing. I'm not saying there isn't. I'm just saying the use of this term to describe this problem is not only inaccurate, but it is actively alienating some of the people who need to be involved in fixing the problem.
Mm,
Uh,
good point.
but
Yeah. But you're right. She does have things to say. Amy
yeah,
has
I'm
things to say
tangenting.
about gender roles. And I guess we would be remiss if we didn't bring up the cool girl monologue because I do remember when this book first came out, this was something that people often brought up about the book was Amy has this whole monologue about how men want the cool girl who can, pound back hot dogs and beer, but still stay a size two.
Yeah.
And she doesn't care if you go out drinking with your buddies. And I did read something that was like, 20 years later, Gone Girl still holds up. And the only thing that doesn't quite hold up is the cool girl monologue. So I don't know if there's anything to
I
say about that or not,
I
but
don't think
yeah.
she's entirely wrong. I think that is that people have very warped expectations of what women should be. I think that a lot of people are very
Mm.
warped ideas about what men should be too, not necessarily to the same extent, obviously, but I think that she has a point. A lot of people do want that, do think that exists, and do think they are owed that for some reason.
And I think she even says like what a cool girl is depends on who
Changes, yeah.
changes depending on the man, but basically that yeah, like, you have some ideal that you think a woman should live up to. Um so
What
yeah, I oh, go ahead.
Oh no, no, I didn't mean to cut you off, especially whilst we're talking about this.
Right, right. And then it becomes very clear that why this is in there. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it's not like that has gone away completely. And we do not have to get deep into this, but I do, think that you hear people say like because porn has created a lot of, unrealistic expectations, both of what women's bodies look like or what women want. And, maybe that's the extenuation of the cool girl speech is,
I mean,
yeah, there's just
media in general and
media in
society in general,
general. Yeah.
it's all contributed to that. But one of the things that
Yeah.
I think is like one of the reasons I'm glad you brought it up actually, is because Amy is a raging hypocrite.
Yes. Well, she's very unreliable. So, yes, also hypocritical.
Because she also has a expectations of what I mean everyone should be, but what she thinks men have to be, what she thinks women have to be. This idea that she's owed perfection. That sounds familiar.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I think makes her a sort of interesting character and also such a piece of work is that she is a weaponizing feminism.
Ooh,
Like she is using it to just like this idea of the cool girl problem and patriarchy and all this stuff. She is using it to justify her own bad behavior.
right.
It's manipulative to the audience, to the world around her, and also to herself to an extent because she's convincing herself that it's okay that she's doing this because of all these other societal problems. And that's
Right.
why I think it's worth talking about.
Well, I mean, okay, so I think one of the things that is so fascinating when you have, and I don't necessarily know that there is a clear villain in this novel, but for the sake of this
Well,
argument,
I think there's a lot of
we'll call Amy a villain. But I do think it's so interesting to get sort of the quote unquote madman logic, right? Of like your villain. And so in this case, Amy, like she has this logic that makes sense to her. She has this mindset and these justifications that we from the outside are like, oh no, that is,
I mean,
actually I
the
wrote
scary.
this
Oh,
down.
sorry, you go.
Oh, let's see. So, okay, I wrote this down as an example of real Amy's voice, but I think it proves my point here. So she says, "It's rather extreme framing your husband for your murder. I want you to know that I know that. All the tut-tutters out there will say she should have just left, bundled up what remained of her dignity, taken the high road. Two wrongs don't make a right. All those things that spineless women say, confusing their weakness with morality." So she's got this mindset and this justification for her ludicrous actions. And that is so interesting. I think when you're a writer creating a villain, you don't want your villain to just be straight up evil, even if they're doing evil things. You want them to, you want to understand their psychology of like, well, how are they justifying this themselves? How are they thinking about this in a way that makes sense to them, like that madman logic? And that's so fascinating,
Yeah,
you
I
know?
mean, it's very hard to craft a believable villain who is doing evil and believes they are doing evil. It's possible, as depending on the setting and the tone and all these things. Like some people, you get some characters who are like, "Yeah, this is evil and I love it. This is great. I thrive on it.
Dr. Evil.
I know that I know this is evil and I don't care. Like you can do that and make that compelling, but the more grounded your book is, the harder it is to pull that off. So
Yeah, yeah,
having Amy not just not to be doing this, for shits and giggles, but having her believe that this is completely justified because of like all the things we've already talked about, because of her perception of weakness, because she believes she's owed it, because she's convinced herself about this sort of not really a conspiracy, but the system, the way it
right.
works and things like that. She believes that she is justified
And
in
she
her
feels
evil.
like Nick needs this. Like she's doing something that Nick needs. He needs to have this happen to him, you know?
Yeah, oh yeah, she's making him better. She makes him her words in the movie, I think also in the book, is that she elevates him to her level. Good God,
Right.
she's so conceited.
She really is. She really is. Yeah. She, as you said, she's a piece of work. Yeah, but you're right. She kind of takes all of these things and then totally uses them to her own advantage and as a justification for her completely, I mean, I don't like to use the word crazy, but in this case, her completely crazy scheme.
Yeah, no, I gotta tell you, I think if ever there was a place where it's justified, it's probably here.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's all just the more we talk about it, the more I'm just like Gillian Flynn is a master. This is a masterpiece. It's you know, I don't use the word flawless lightly, but I feel like this is a flawless psychological thriller. It's just it's so good.
I don't believe that anything is truly flawless. I think if we really, really wanted to, if we picked through this with
We
a
could pick
fine-tooth
something.
comb, we could
Yeah.
find something, especially in something that's at least somewhat subjective because it's art.
Hmm. Yeah.
But the fact that we would have to go to that kind of extreme, yeah, it's a really, really good book. And is a Gillian Flynn is a I don't know her personally, is
Good old Jill.
yeah, sh- she is an extremely skilled writer,
Yeah.
and I mean,
Yes.
yeah, she's just very, very skilled at what she does.
Now you
I need to
know
look at some of
she
her other
has
books.
yeah, I mean they're good too. I've read her other books, but this one is, I mean, I think this is the masterpiece. But you know, she is a publisher now. She has her own publishing imprint or something. I think it's called Zando. I could be or maybe it's part of Zando. She has an imprint at Zando. So I was like, well, if Gillian Flynn is picking out books, then I bet I'm going to have the same taste as her. And I did. I read a book recently that came out through her imprint called The Center. And I'll have to tell you the author's name later because I can't remember it, but it was really good. So I would recommend if you've read all the Gillian Flynn books, go look at her imprint and see what she's publishing, you know.
Interestingly enough, the version of the book that I have, because I picked up the special edition, which includes talking points for book clubs for anyone who's interested, as well as interview sort of thing where Gillian talks about her own thoughts about the book and the characters in and things like that. But it also has recommended reading, a list of
Oh.
other books that she suggests that if you like this one that you should look into.
Oh, that's
Which,
interesting.
yeah, let's. There's Strangers on a Train by Patricia Highsmith, Defending
Yep.
Jacob by William Landay, Broken by Karen Slaughter. That sounds familiar. When Will There Be Good News by Kate Atkinson, and By a Spider's Thread by Laura Lippman is the suggested further reading for anyone
Hmm.
who's interested.
I've only read one of those, so this is good news. Yeah, and I
I'll
looked
write
it
out the
up.
list and send it to you later if you want.
Okay, yeah, and I looked, so it's an imprint of Zando called Gillian Flynn Books. And yeah, so she's got I guess she's an editor now and picking out books to publish. And like I said, I was like, well, I think I trust her taste. So um, but yeah. Well, are there any is there anything else we need to talk about? I feel like we've done a thorough job.
Yeah, no, we've covered pretty much anything. So if there's any like final thoughts or anything you have that you want to add to any of that, feel free. But I don't have much to add. I've said my piece, and I agree with most of the things you've said. So probably all the things you've said actually.
I think I already said this, but I'll just reiterate that, it is I read a lot of thrillers, and thrillers are very plot driven, and sometimes the writing is fine, it's serviceable, for the plot. But I think that this book, to use the word elevate, it is elevated with the incredible prose. So it's like not only is it fast paced and twisty and incredibly plotted, but the prose is just it's masterful. So definitely worth a read or reread. So yeah.
I'm inclined to it. And there is one thing I will add to that in addition to the incredible prose, which I again you are completely right. The thing she does with words very impressive. But
Yes.
Gillian Flynn is also an author who very clearly understands and has a very strong grasp on our mantra on, well, mostly the other podcast, but also this one now probably, and anywhere I write about writing is that even in a genre that is very plot driven, like thriller, it doesn't matter how good your plot is, as long as if no one cares about your characters. They don't have to
Hmm.
like them, they just have to care about them. And that is what makes people get invested in the plot. And I mean, we already talked about how all the reasons that opening couple pages works.
Yeah, yeah, you got it. Yes, it's so true. It's so true. And going back to what we said a long time ago about, are there no new stories? It's like, who was it who said, there are only two stories, a man goes on a journey or a stranger comes to town or something like that. But it's really about how you tell a story. At the end of the day, it's like we'll always have new things because everybody can put their own spin and tell, even if it's similar to something else, they're going to tell it in their own unique way.
Yeah,
So
take that, Nick.
that's right.
Um, but yeah, no, I think we have covered pretty much everything we need to do that. So we can wrap that up there. Where can people find you and your work?
Oh, yes. Well, I would love it if they would come find me on my Substack. It's evalangston.substack.com. It's a newsletter. I put out 2 free ones a month with tons of resources wherever you are on the writing journey, whether you're just starting out or you're querying agents or anything in between. And I also am. I'm a co-host of the podcast This Mama is Lit, where we interview writers who are also mothers. But I will be starting soon my own podcast called The Long Journey to Publishing. And I'm going to interview authors who have had a long and bumpy road with many roadblocks, but have finally reached that published novel. So we can be looking out for that soon.
That is exciting. I'll have to keep an eye out for
Yeah.
that. And yeah, I mean, chances are, if you're listening to this, you probably know where to find my work. But if you're listening to this on YouTube or Spotify or wherever else it shows up, you can also find all my podcast stuff as well as various blogs and articles and things like that, and also buy my books and read other stories and things like that. You can do all of that on my website, radfordwrites.com. So feel free to go and check that out. And yeah, we could leave it there. Thank you for coming on.
All right. Thank you so much. This was so fun. And it gave me an excuse to reread Gone Girl. So that was great.
Mission accomplished.
All right. Well, thanks so much. And yeah, I'll be excited to hear this when it comes out and the ghost one when that one comes out.
Oh, I mean, funny you mentioned that. As at time of recording this, when you guys hear this, it will already be out. But at time of recording this, it's tomorrow.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's exciting. Okay, awesome. Well, I will be excited to listen to that then.
Goodbye.
All right. Bye.